On 30 November 2025, US President Donald Trump commuted the sentence of convicted fraudster David Gentile, allowing him to avoid almost all of his prison time for running a $1.8 billion Ponzi scheme. We're going to tell you what he did, how it was a Ponzi scheme, and try to explore why the US federal government has just let him off. This is the podcast that helps keep your family safe from scams, hacks, and frauds. David Gentile founded GBP Capital Holdings in 2013. GPB buy businesses like car dealerships, freezer warehouse, waste management companies, IT management, and life sciences companies, and package them into investment funds. They provide some back office and strategy support, collect profits, and pass these profits in turn to investors, and market those funds to investors through brokers who, in turn, sold investments in this fund to regular people. This isn't a particularly unusual or controversial thing to do. Funds like these allow you to invest in an industry or area without the risk of putting all your money into a single business. If you invested in one car dealership and it failed, all of your money would be gone. Invest in a fund that buys car dealerships, and if one fails, then much of your investment remains intact. David Gentile's firm, GBP, manages the funds and, in theory at least, passes these profits and other earnings to investors. It made its money on paper at least through fees and expenses for managing these funds. In its filings, the SEC called these fees and expenses substantial, collecting over $79 million in management fees alone over 6 years. Other linked and affiliated companies took in an additional $187 million, so they certainly weren't talking chicken feed. Part of GBP and their affiliates' marketing push was a promise of an 8% payment from profits each year. In addition, they paid an extra amount, up to 3% per year, supposedly depending on performance. From what I've been able to research, these amounts aren't unusual. But what was unusual was the consistency. Over the 4 years it operated, the funds were consistently paying these rates, and according to the SEC's complaint, GPB said that these amounts were based on cash flow generated by the businesses and investments in the fund, with affiliates stating that they were fully covered with funds from operations since inception. But the SEC stated that this was not true. You might remember from our episode on Charles' Ponzi scheme that he was paying out people who wanted to leave his investment scheme by taking money from newer investments. Of the $262 million paid supposedly from profits to investors of GPB and Gentile's investment scheme, $137 million was actually paid from money invested by newer investors, or about 52%. That's what makes GPB's, and by extension David Gentile's scheme, a Ponzi scheme. In order to maintain the payments to investors and themselves, they were robbing Peter to pay Paul. And reports suggest they were taking a lot for themselves. Ferraris, $30,000 birthday parties, private jets, and the staff to run those jets. But as all Ponzi schemes do, it would eventually collapse. In 2018, the fund stopped people from cashing out their investment. The auditor quit, and they missed the deadline to file reports. The federal government got involved, raided GPB in 2019, and the states would follow. After a lot of investigation, Gentile would be charged in 2021, with trial following in 2024, sentencing almost a year later. Gentile was sentenced to 7 years in May 2025, required to pay $15 million in fines, and reported to prison in November 2025. But less than 2 weeks later, he was released. Now this is where things get weird. Gentile's case didn't really get any attention at the time. There were the usual press releases from government departments involved in the case, but there is very little media coverage from the time. Pretty much everything that you can find on the case comes from the end of November or early December 2025. In an extraordinary and unexpected intervention, President Trump commuted Gentile's sentence, which may also wipe out the $15 million fine. This intervention has brought attention to the case it didn't get first time around. The White House has issued a statement saying they believe the case was politically motivated, and the case should not have been brought, and they claim that there was wording in the required disclosures saying that returns might come from newer investors without pointing to any of these in particular. Meanwhile, the original complaint cites wording saying that the returns would come from cash flow and the businesses. I've been unable to locate any evidence that suggests Gentile had been politically active on either side or had made donations to any political party. At Scams, Hacks and Frauds, we are impartial and non-partisan, though we're not unbiased. We're unashamedly biased against scammers. This type of intervention against a court verdict for fraud is an alarming precedent and sends the message that running a fraudulent scheme in which you enrich yourself at the expense of your investors is an acceptable part of the business world, and it absolutely should not be. This instance of a Ponzi scheme lacked any initial red flags that a casual investor could spot. Today's episode is more of a reaction to the news than the typical cautionary tales we tell, but I do want to leave you with some advice. If you are getting into investments, unless you absolutely know what you are doing, you absolutely should be speaking with a financial advisor. And even if you do, it can't hurt to get another perspective. Treat any guarantees of return from investment with skepticism, and consider focusing on investment opportunities with long-term records of delivering realistic results. It doesn't necessarily mean there's nothing wrong with those businesses, but it's really hard to run a Ponzi scheme for decades, though Bernie Madoff did manage it, but that's a story for another day. I've been C, and this has been Scams, Hacks and Frauds. We'll be back with more scam, hack and fraud stories in 2026. This podcast is available to reuse for free under the Creative Commons with Attribution Share Alike license. The music is not included in this license. For more information on the Creative Commons license, please visit creativecommons.org.